The sound of a full-grown man hitting packed dirt is not subtle. It's a wet, heavy crack that lands in your sternum a half-second before your ears even register it. One moment the backyard was humming with the ordinary noise of a summer cookout, the hiss of burgers on a cheap grill, the clink of bottle caps, the lazy murmur of relatives who hadn't seen each other since Christmas. The next moment, all of it was gone, replaced by that single sickening sound, and a silence so total it felt like the whole block had forgotten how to breathe. I was already kneeling over him by the time anyone reacted. My weight settled onto his back with the easy, unhurried comfort of someone sinking into a couch cushion. My forearm was locked beneath his jaw, my hand cupped around my own bicep in a hold so clean it could have come from a training manual, because it had. Underneath me, Tyler, my 22-year-old cousin, freshly minted infantry soldier, was bucking like something trying to escape a net. His face had gone from sunburned pink to a deep, alarming shade of plum, and his palm was slapping frantically against my forearm. Tap, tap, tap. I wasn't straining. I wasn't even really paying attention to him. I was looking past his shoulder at the rest of them. My Aunt Carol had let a serving spoon slip straight into the potato salad, her mouth hanging open mid-sentence. My Uncle Pete stood frozen with a beer bottle halfway to his lips, his eyebrows somewhere near his hairline. None of them had actually seen how I'd gotten there. To this family, I was just Sienna, the cousin who taught hot yoga on weekdays and did something with logistics that nobody bothered to ask about twice. They had no idea that while Tyler was learning to fold a fitted sheet into a perfect 12x18 rectangle at basic training, I had spent 3 years quietly dismantling smuggling networks across 2 continents. To understand why I ended up choking out my own cousin at a welcome home barbecue, you first have to understand the difference between a soldier and a ghost. A soldier gets a uniform, a rank, a unit patch, and a homecoming banner strung across the garage door. A soldier's mother can say the job title out loud at a dinner party, and everyone nods along, satisfied. A ghost gets none of that. A ghost gets a cover story so boring that people stop asking follow-up questions within the first 10 seconds, and a family who quietly assumes the boring cover story is the whole truth. I chose that life at 19, in a recruiter's office that smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner, after a scout from a program I'm still not allowed to name in full sat across from me and asked exactly one question. Are you willing to disappear for a living? I said yes before I'd even finished thinking about what it meant. 6 years, 4 continents, and more names than I can comfortably count later, I still don't regret the answer. I just regret how much of it I've had to hide from the people who raised me. 3 hours earlier, the mood in that backyard had been something else entirely. It was Tyler's welcome home party, and the air was thick with July humidity and unearned hero worship. He'd just come off the bus from basic training 2 days prior, and he was still riding that particular high. The loud, electric confidence of a young man who has learned to fire a rifle on a flat range, but has never once had to point it at something that could shoot back. My parents were beaming at him from across the yard, wearing the kind of radiant, unguarded pride they usually reserved for lottery winnings or children who hadn't disappointed them. I sat off to the side with a lukewarm can of soda sweating in my hand, next to Jonah, a former teammate of mine who'd flown in that weekend under the flimsy cover story of being my +1. He wasn't really my date. He was there because showing up alone meant fielding a dozen questions about my love life, and Jonah made a convenient, disinterested buffer. We watched my parents fuss over Tyler's new haircut, his straighter posture, the way he said sir to his own father as a joke. I kept my face pleasant and blank, but internally I was doing what I always did at these things, keeping score. They saw a warrior in a fresh uniform. I saw a kid who hadn't yet learned that a uniform doesn't stop a bullet, it just tells people where to aim. My little cousin Ruby, 11 years old and endlessly curious, plopped down in the folding chair beside me and asked, in the blunt way only children manage, why I never talked about my job the way Tyler talked about his. I told her the truth wrapped in a joke, that freight coordination didn't come with a cool uniform, so nobody ever wanted the story. She accepted that answer easily, the way kids accept most things adults tell them, and went back to chasing the family dog around the yard. I watched her go and felt, not for the first time, a small ache at how easily a lie could satisfy someone who actually loved me, simply because the truth had never been offered as an option. The grill smoke drifted low across the lawn, carrying the smell of charred meat and cheap lighter fluid. Somewhere near the fence, a radio played a classic rock station just loud enough to be background noise. It was, by every visible measure, an ordinary family afternoon. That was the part that always got to me, how thin the membrane was between this and the version of the world I actually operated in. One phone call, one flight, and I'd trade this lawn for a rooftop somewhere with a different sun overhead. Nobody at this party would ever know the difference, because I'd never let them see the seam. Eventually, the ambient admiration wasn't enough for him. Tyler stood, cleared a patch of lawn, and announced he wanted to show everyone a few moves from combatives training. He threw a couple of clumsy shadow strikes at the air, grinning at the scattered applause from uncles who wouldn't know a hip throw from a bear hug. Then his eyes landed on me. I was the easiest target in the yard, the slender cousin in yoga pants, nursing a warm soda, minding her own business. "You look fit," he announced, loud enough for the whole patio to hear, gesturing at my arms with a smirk that had clearly been rehearsed in a barracks mirror. "But that gym stuff's useless in the real world. All that stretching, you wouldn't last 5 seconds out there." He reached out and closed his hand around my wrist. It was meant to look playful, a little demonstration for the crowd, but his grip was tight, an amateur attempt at a wristlock that left his whole structure wide open. "See," he laughed, twisting just enough to sting. "You're already dead." My hand didn't move. My pulse didn't spike. But somewhere in the part of my brain, I'd spent a decade sharpening into something cold and precise. A switch flickered on and then off again. My fingers twitched, a half-formed reflex to break his radius and collapse his windpipe in the same motion, and I forced them still. He had no idea he'd just grabbed the wrist of a woman who had put men twice his size on the ground without a sound. My parents had a very particular tone reserved just for me, a frequency of apology and faint embarrassment they trotted out whenever new company arrived. My mother, Diane, treated the family's reputation like a piece of antique china she was certain I was about to drop. "Oh, Sienna," she'd say, waving a manicured hand like she was shooing a fly, "she's still doing that freight coordination thing. Import-export, moving cargo, that sort of thing. Pays the bills. Not glamorous like what Tyler's doing, but you know." To them, I was a drifter. A woman inching toward 30 with no husband, no fixed address, and a job title they couldn't repeat at a dinner party without sounding unsure. They looked at me and saw wasted potential. If they'd actually seen what I did to keep their comfortable little world spinning, they wouldn't have been disappointed. They would have been terrified. Then there was Tyler, the family's newly polished golden child, 3 months into a uniform, already being treated like he'd personally stormed a beach. He stood by the cooler describing the brutal 5 a.m. wake-ups at basic training with the gravity of a war memoir, and my uncles nodded along like he was reciting scripture. They looked at him and saw a warrior. They looked at me and saw a waste of a good education. It hadn't always been this lopsided. When we were kids, Tyler and I used to be close, closer than most cousins, actually, thanks to summers spent at my grandparents' lake house, where we'd built forts and argued over board games, and once, memorably, gotten equally grounded for setting off a bottle rocket too close to the boathouse. Somewhere around high school, the dynamic shifted. He leaned into sports and bravado, chasing the kind of easy, visible validation that came from scoring touchdowns in front of a packed stand. I leaned the opposite direction, quiet and unremarkable on paper, drawn toward the kind of discipline nobody claps for endurance runs before sunrise, hours on a mat learning to fall correctly, languages studied alone in a library carrel. Nobody in the family ever framed my path as impressive because it didn't come with a scoreboard. His did. That asymmetry calcified over the years into exactly the dynamic playing out in this backyard. A family fluent in celebrating loud, visible effort, and completely illiterate in recognizing the quiet kind. I sipped my flat soda and bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, just to keep from laughing. The irony was suffocating. 3 weeks earlier, while Tyler was learning to iron creases into his uniform, I had been crouched in a safe house near a border checkpoint that officially did not exist on any map issued to civilians. I hadn't been moving cargo. I'd been running close protection for an asset whose real name I still don't. No, I wasn't wearing yoga pants and a messy bun. I was carrying 50 pounds of gear, my face striped in paint, the world reduced to the grainy green wash of a night vision scope. Hold position, I'd whispered into my throat mic, the words barely a vibration. Corner check, fatal funnel, 12 o'clock. The breach was supposed to be clean. In my line of work, supposed to is the phrase that gets people killed. A door on the left had opened a half-second before we cleared it. A hostile stepped through, weapon rising. The two men behind me, both excellent at their jobs, were a fraction of a beat too slow. I wasn't. I didn't consciously decide to move. My body simply ran the program it had rehearsed 10,000 times. I closed the gap before his rifle leveled, slid inside his reach, spun him, and locked my forearm under his chin, the exact motion Tyler had just mocked out on the lawn. Except in that hallway, there was no tapping. I hadn't applied the pressure to make a point. I'd applied it to end a threat. I felt the fight drain out of him, his weight going heavy and dead against my chest. I lowered him silently, checked my sector, and kept moving. Behind me, I heard Jonah's voice in my earpiece, flat and controlled despite the adrenaline. Clear left. Package secure, moving to exfil. 4 more doors and a stairwell stood between us and the extraction point, and every one of them had to be handled with the same silent precision. Because in that hallway, noise wasn't just dangerous. It was fatal for everyone behind me too. The rest of the building cleared without incident, 3 more rooms, a stairwell, a final hallway that smelled like diesel and dust, each one handled with the same economy of motion, the same absence of wasted noise. We reached the vehicle 11 minutes after breach, right on the timeline we'd rehearsed a dozen times in a mock-up building back at base. Nobody spoke until we were 3 kilometers out. That's the part people never understand about this work. It isn't the violence that stays with you. It's the silence afterward, the total absence of anything resembling an adrenaline high, because you trained the high out of yourself years ago. You just move to the next task, and the next, until the plane ride home, when it finally catches up to you somewhere over open water, and you sit very still in your seat and let it pass through you like weather. That was the truth nobody at this cookout would ever know. I wasn't a freight coordinator shuffling paperwork. I was the person you called when the paperwork had already failed. Back in the present, the contrast was almost dizzying. Tyler was now lecturing his own father about situational awareness, chest puffed out, beer in hand. You gotta keep your head on a swivel, Dad, he said. You never know where a threat's coming from. He said this with his back completely turned to the open side gate, utterly oblivious to the delivery driver walking up the driveway behind him. He was reciting lines from a manual he'd barely skimmed. I, on the other hand, couldn't turn it off if I tried. I leaned against the porch railing, eyes tracking without my permission. I'd already clocked the exits, the rusted latch on the side gate, the unlocked sliding door, the thick hedge along the east fence line that offered decent concealment. I noted my aunt holding a kitchen knife to cut the cake, filed it away as a nearby object that could become a weapon in under a second, and registered that the family dog had gone restless near the grill. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit. I was quietly calculating cover and concealment between bites of potato salad. Jonah nudged my elbow, breaking the loop. He was the only person here who knew the truth, that the logistics coordinator, standing beside him, had a longer resume of quiet, violent competence than the entire local police department combined. He caught me watching the exposed line of Tyler's throat while he laughed at his own joke. Stand down, yoga teacher, Jonah murmured, low enough that only I could hear, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. We're not overseas, the burgers aren't hostile. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and pasted on a smile. It felt stiff, borrowed, like a mask 2 sizes too small. I glanced at my parents, still hanging on Tyler's every word, and felt that old, familiar sting, the internal ledger updating itself one more time. They would never look at me the way they looked at him. They'd never know that the safety letting them drink beer in the sun on a Sunday afternoon had been paid for, in part, by things I'd done in the dark and never talked about. It took every ounce of my discipline to keep smiling while he lectured me on toughness. But discipline is what keeps you breathing. Ego is what gets you carried out on a stretcher. Tyler was about to learn that the hard way. My father wandered over at one point, clapping a hand on my shoulder with the easy affection he always shown me and asked, not unkindly, whether I'd ever thought about settling into something more stable. I told him I liked the travel. He nodded, patted my shoulder again, and drifted back toward Tyler's orbit, satisfied with an answer that told him nothing. I didn't blame him for not pushing further. I'd built the wall myself, brick by brick, over a decade of vague answers and convenient half-truths, precisely so nobody would ever feel compelled to lean on it too hard. As the afternoon wore on, the cooler emptied and Tyler's bravado swelled right along with it, fueled by cheap lager and an audience that didn't know any better. He wanted a live demonstration, proof that 3 months of training had made him superior to everyone else in the yard. His eyes swept the crowd and landed on me again, narrowing with a predator's clumsy confidence. "Come on, cuz," he said, voice slurring slightly as he stepped into my space, grinning in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I promise I won't hurt you. Just want to show everybody the difference between gym strong and combat strong." It was a challenge thrown down in front of the whole tribe, a way to elevate himself by making a spectacle of me. I felt the collective weight of my parents' attention settle on us, waiting to see whether I'd embarrass them. I didn't take the bait. In my world, you don't fight unless there's no other option left, and you never, ever fight for applause. "Tyler, sit down," I said, keeping my tone flat and bored, the voice of a tired cousin who just wanted to finish her burger in peace. "Enjoy the party. Nobody wants to watch us wrestle in the grass." I thought that would be the end of it, a polite exit that let him keep his pride intact. But to a man like Tyler, a refusal only ever looks like fear. "Don't be a snowflake, Sienna," he sneered, glancing back at our uncles for approval, feeding off their expectant grins. "1 round, unless you're scared you'll chip a nail." Jonah stepped forward then, sliding smoothly between us with the practiced ease of a man who always knows exactly where everyone in a room is standing. "Tyler," he said, his voice dropping out of its easy party register. "You really don't want to do this, trust me." It was a lifeline, a professional warning dressed up as friendly advice. Tyler just laughed and waved a dismissive hand at him. "Back off, civilian boyfriend," he scoffed, chest puffing further. "Let the grown-ups handle this." He didn't catch the look Jonah shot me, a subtle shake of the head that said, "I tried." Then Tyler made the mistake that changed everything. He reached out and shoved my shoulder, hard enough to rattle my teeth and force a step back. "Come on," he barked, dropping into a jagged amateur boxing stance, fists raised high beside his face. "Fight back." That shove was the permission slip. He'd crossed the line from annoying relative to physical aggressor. The yoga instructor mask didn't just slip, it shattered. I set my drink down on the porch rail, slow and deliberate, and looked straight through him. I didn't raise my fists. I didn't bounce on my toes or tuck my chin. I stood completely still, hands open and loose at my sides, weight settled evenly on both feet. It wasn't the posture of someone getting ready to box. It was the posture of someone getting ready to end a threat. The chatter in the yard died as people noticed the shift in my eyes, the sudden, total absence of anything playful. I wasn't Sienna anymore, not for the next 4 seconds. I'd given him 3 separate chances to walk away. In my line of work, you rarely get one. He mistook my patience for fear. Big mistake. The circle closed around us with the speed of a schoolyard fight, aunts and uncles tightening the perimeter, phones lifting like a row of small digital torches. They were grinning, expecting a bit of harmless comedy, the big strong soldier gently tossing his delicate cousin into the grass for laughs. My mother clutched her wine glass with a look of preloaded pity on her face, already rehearsing the comforting words she'd offer me afterward. It was the exact same expression she'd given me the time I missed prom, or the time I didn't get into the college she wanted. A look that assumed my failure was already a foregone conclusion. Uncle Pete had already pulled out his phone to film it, murmuring something to Aunt Carol about how this would make a great clip for the family group chat. Even Ruby had wandered back over, tugging on her mother's sleeve to ask what was happening, only to be shushed and told to watch. This would be funny. Nobody in that circle, not one single person, had the faintest idea what they were actually about to witness. They thought they'd bought tickets to a comedy. They were about to get a masterclass instead. But inside that circle, the air had changed completely. I wasn't at a barbecue anymore. I was in a live environment, and the man across from me wasn't family. He was a var. Wiable that needed resolving. Tyler bounced on his toes, burning energy he didn't have to spare, hands held high in a guard that left his ribs completely exposed. He looked like an actor playing a boxer in a low-budget movie, mistaking motion for skill. I stood flat-footed, breathing slow, watching his shoulders instead of his hands, the way I'd been trained to watch 100 times over. Hands lie, shoulders don't. He circled once, twice, throwing a couple of tentative jabs at the air between us to test whether I'd flinch. I didn't. My stillness seemed to unsettle him more than any countermove could have. I watched a flicker of uncertainty cross his face before his pride overrode it, and he committed to something bigger. He telegraphed the strike from a mile away, a dip in the right shoulder, a tightening jaw, practically mailing me an invitation before he even threw the punch. When he finally lunged, it was a wide, looping hook aimed at my collar, a move built on arrogance rather than technique. He expected me to flinch, to scramble backward like someone out of her depth. I stepped in instead. I closed the distance in an instant, invading the space he'd assumed was his. It's the one thing an amateur never sees coming, the target becoming the projectile. My left hand caught his forearm and redirected it past me with almost no effort, so that his own momentum carried him forward off balance. In the same beat, I stepped my hip across his center line, broke his footing, and swept his lead leg out from under him. It wasn't a struggle, it was physics. There was a blur of motion, a half-second of suspended weight, and then that heavy, unmistakable thud of a 200-pound body hitting the ground with nothing to break its fall. The air left his lungs in a violent rush that cut through the ambient chatter like a gunshot. Somewhere behind me, I heard a phone clatter onto the patio stones as someone forgot they were holding it. A dog barked once sharply, then went quiet, sensing the shift in the yard before most of the humans did. Time did that strange thing it always did in moments like this, stretching thin and slow even as the actual movement happened in well under a second. I registered all of it peripherally, the way you register weather, without letting any of it slow down what my hands were already doing. I didn't give him a second to reset. Before he could scramble, I was already transitioning to his back with the smooth, automatic muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions. My legs hooked around his waist to lock the position, my right arm sliding under his chin. I didn't go for his windpipe, that's messy and it hurts for no reason. I went for the carotids, a clean blood choke that shuts the lights out fast. I laced my hands together and cinched down, pressing my chest flat against his back to keep him from bucking free. He thrashed, his hands clawing uselessly at my forearm, panic overriding whatever training he had. I leaned in close to his ear, creating a small, private moment of instruction in the middle of the spectacle. "Control your breathing," I said quietly, my voice flat and calm against the noise of his struggle. "You're flailing like you've never drilled a day in your life. Tap or nap." His face had gone a deep, mottled purple, his eyes bulging as the oxygen to his brain dropped. For the first time, he understood this wasn't a game. I held his consciousness, in the crook of my elbow, for exactly as long as I needed to. His palm slapped my forearm. Tap, tap, tap. I released instantly, uncoiling and rising to my feet in one smooth motion. My breathing hadn't changed. My hair wasn't even out of place. I stood over him, watching him cough and heave, with the same detached, clinical interest of a surgeon closing an incision. The backyard was quieter than the humidity had any right to allow. For the first time in his life, Tyler looked up at me and didn't see a cousin. He saw a superior officer. The adrenaline crash that usually follows a fight is the dangerous part, shaking hands, tunnel vision. I felt none of it, just a cool, settled calm. Tyler lay in the grass, chest heaving like a bellows, both hands wrapped around his own throat as he tried to coax air back into lungs that had briefly been switched off. The circle of relatives had widened, everyone stepping back as though I'd become a down power line sparking on wet pavement. I looked toward my parents. The pity was gone from my mother's face, replaced by a hollow, stunned confusion. My father was staring at me as though a stranger had just stepped out from beneath his daughter's skin. I reached a hand down toward Tyler. He flinched at first, a fair reaction from someone who had just been choked unconscious by a family member, But then he really looked at my face and saw something shift behind it. The operator was fading back beneath the cousin again. I wasn't a threat anymore. I was just Sienna. He took my hand, grip shaky, palm slick W. Ith sweat, and I hauled him up with a single steady pull. He rubbed at his throat, staring at me with wide, wet eyes. "Where the hell," he rasped, voice raw, "did you learn that?" I let a small, harmless smile settle back into place, though we both knew now it didn't quite fit the way it used to. "Yoga retreat," I said lightly. "Ashrams get intense if you break the silence rule." Off by the cooler, Jonah let out a short bark of laughter that he quickly disguised as a cough, shaking his head at the sheer audacity of the lie. The silence held, thick and uncomfortable, until the crunch of heavy boots on gravel broke it. It was my grandfather, a Vietnam veteran who usually spent these gatherings parked in a lawn chair by the tree line, nursing a can of cheap beer and saying almost nothing. He walked into the center of the circle with the slow, deliberate gait of a man whose joints had cost him plenty over the decades, but whose eyes had lost none of their sharpness. He didn't glance at the potato salad or the stunned relatives. He looked at Tyler first, then turned those faded gray eyes on me. He studied my hands, still relaxed and loose at my sides. Then he looked into my eyes, and something in his expression made a chill run straight down my spine. He saw it, the training, the discipline, the violence I kept folded up small and quiet, like a parachute packed for an emergency that never officially happened. Nobody in the family talked much about what my grandfather had actually done in Vietnam. He'd come home in 1971, gone quiet for most of his adult life, and built a career doing something equally unremarkable sounding. Inventory management. He always called it, which had taken him, apparently, all over Southeast Asia for reasons nobody ever thought to question. I used to think that was just a coincidence. Standing in that circle, watching him study my hands with the calm precision of someone who'd spent decades reading exactly this kind of moment, I understood for the first time that it probably wasn't. He gave a single, slow nod, the kind that means something between people who have actually seen combat. "Nice technique, kid," he rumbled, voice like gravel shifting underfoot. "Clean, no wasted movement, you controlled the drop the whole way down." He turned to Tyler, who was still gingerly massaging his bruised ego along with his throat. "You got beat by a professional, son," my grandfather said, loud enough for my parents to hear clearly. "Nothing to be ashamed of, just quit picking fights you can't win, and for God's sake, keep your chin tucked next time." That single sentence did more for me than the chokehold ever could. A decade's worth of quiet dismissal seemed to evaporate right there in the humid afternoon air. The rest of the party dissolved into hushed conversations and sidelong glances. My parents didn't come over to demand an explanation. They didn't ask for the truth, not really. I don't think, deep down, they actually wanted it. But something in the family's gravity had shifted, and it wasn't subtle. When I walked over to grab a bottle of water, my uncle stepped out of my path without being asked. My mother didn't interrupt me once to redirect the conversation back to Tyler's future plans. For the rest of the afternoon, people looked at me with a strange new mixture of caution and respect, the slow realization that the invisible cousin had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Not because she was weak. Because she'd chosen to be quiet. Later that evening, after most of the relatives had trickled home and the yard had gone dim and blue with dusk, my father found me sitting alone on the back step. He didn't ask about the chokehold, or the 11 out of 10 precision of the leg sweep, or the flat, unfamiliar calm he'd seen come over my face in the middle of the circle. He just sat down next to me, quiet for a long moment, and said he was sorry he'd never asked more questions over the years. It wasn't an apology for anything specific. It was an apology for the shape of an absence, for a decade of assuming the boring answer was the whole answer, simply because I'd never given him a reason to dig further. I told him it was fine. I told him some things are easier to carry alone. He didn't push, and I didn't offer more, but something between us had loosened just slightly, like a knot that had finally been given room to breathe. Ruby found me too, before her parents loaded her into the car, and asked in a small voice whether I was some kind of secret agent, like in the movies. I laughed and told her freight coordinators occasionally need very specific self-defense training, and left it at that. She seemed satisfied, though I caught her studying my hands one more time before she climbed into the back seat, the way her great-grandfather had studied them earlier, like she was starting to understand there was a whole version of me she'd never been shown. 6 months later, the green lawn and the smell of charcoal smoke were a distant memory. I was sitting on the open ramp of a cargo plane, the roar of the engines shaking up through the metal decking and into my bones. Fully geared, the familiar weight of a plate carrier settled onto my shoulders, waiting for wheels up on a deployment that would never officially appear on paper anywhere. My phone buzzed once in my hand, a last tether to the outside world before we went dark. A text from Tyler. Attached was a photo of him in a gym, drenched in sweat, working through grappling drills with a look of grim, focused determination I hadn't seen on him before. Instructors taught us that choke today, the caption read. They called it a blood strangle, told them my cousin does it tighter. Stay safe out there, yoga teacher. I stared at the screen for a moment, the pale glow reflecting off the visor propped on my helmet. There was no big apology in it for years of dismissal, no grand family reconciliation. But there was acknowledgement. He knew now. He understood that while he'd been playing at war for the applause of a backyard crowd, I'd actually been living inside it, and had chosen not to say a single word about it for a decade. I didn't need a parade, I never had. I locked the phone and slid it into my vest pocket as the loadmaster signaled for takeoff. The ramp began to close, sealing out the daylight in slow degrees, and I breathed in the stale, recycled air of the cabin. Jonah, seated across from me with his own helmet already on, caught my eye and gave a small nod, the same kind my grandfather had given me in that backyard 6 months earlier. He didn't need to say anything. We'd both spent enough of our lives being unseen by the people who loved us most that a single knowing look between two ghosts said more than a paragraph ever could. I thought about my grandfather then, sitting in his lawn chair back home, probably nursing a beer and watching the same treeline he always watched, carrying his own decades of silence the same way I carried mine. I understood him now in a way I hadn't before that afternoon. He'd spent 50 years being underestimated by people who loved him, and he'd never once corrected them, because some truths aren't meant to be handed out for free. They're meant to be recognized, quietly, by the people who have earned the right to see them. Somewhere over the ocean, hours into the flight, I found myself thinking about Ruby again, about the way she'd studied my hands before getting into the car, the same careful, curious look my grandfather had given me in that circle. I wondered if, 20 years from now, she'd end up in a seat like this one, geared up and waiting on a ramp, carrying her own version of the silence our family seemed to specialize in. I hoped not. But if she did, I hoped someone would be there to give her the same quiet nod my grandfather had given me, the one that says, without a single wasted word, I see you. I always did. Real strength was never about proving what you're capable of. It's about already knowing, quietly, and never needing anyone else to. If you've ever had to humble someone without raising your voice, you already understand exactly what that afternoon felt like. Sometimes silence lands harder than any punch ever could.